Hello, folks. I've said that environmental science is sort of the study of how the world works and how humans interact with it. So if we're studying how the world works, we'll just call it a game and try to learn the rules of it. So I call this lecture The Rules of the Game. And we will be focusing on energy and nutrients in the biosphere. Whoops. Here we go. Okay, so one of the key rules of how the world works is that energy flows through the biosphere. Here's the Earth, and you know that the living organisms are on the surface of it and in the water and in the atmosphere, and that energy enters and it leaves, okay? So it flows through. But all the matter that's stuck down there on the surface of the Earth pretty much can't escape, and there's pretty much no additions. There's a little bit, but we don't have to consider that. And the matter, while it is there on the planet, it cycles. It moves from organism to organism between the spheres of the Earth. Sometimes it gets locked up in rock, sometimes it's in the atmosphere, but it never leaves or enters. It cycles, okay? So cardinal rules: energy flows through and matter cycles. And so as we progress in this course, we will look at more detail of exactly how that energy flows through and exactly how that matter cycles. Okay, so the learning objectives of this lecture is to begin to understand how energy flows through and how nutrients cycle, and to learn some new ecological terms, and for instance, species, population, community, and to learn how communities are structured. So ecology is a study of biology. It is the study of all processes influencing the distribution and abundance of organisms. So why are organisms where they are, and why are there so many or so few of them where you find them? And it also concerns itself with looking at the interactions between living things and the environment. So there's an interaction, and it's not just a one-way interaction, where the abiotic factors influence the living organisms, but the reverse is also true. Living organisms influence abiotic factors. It's a really fascinating finding of ecology. So I've shown you the hierarchy of life before, and I just wanted to show it to you again and focus in on what we're going to be studying today. Populations, species, communities, and ecosystems is where we're going today. We'll study these other things later. Okay, so let's start not with populations, but with species, because most people have a general idea of what species are, but I want to be very specific about two definitions of the word species. So here they are. The first is called the biological species concept, and the biological species concept is as follows: members of populations or organisms in nature that actually or potentially interbreed. Members of populations. Well, we'll define what populations mean later. But anyway, organisms in nature, so it doesn't count if they're in zoos or in a cage somewhere, but natural organisms that actually interbreed or potentially interbreed. Okie dokie. So a member of, I don't know, a redwood tree in North America is the same biological species as a redwood tree in Asia if they can potentially interbreed. They may not have to actually interbreed to be part of the same species. Okay, so the biological species concept focuses on the potential for breeding. The morphological species concept, or the morphospecies concept, is a species concept based on a defined anatomical form. And when you think about it, there's a lot of species around there on Earth. There's maybe millions of species on Earth. And for most of them, nobody has done the tests to see whether a particular group of organisms that look alike can interbreed with each other. So when we go to, for instance, the tropics, and we collect a massive bug collection by fogging a tree and collecting all the bugs that we find, we are not doing biospecies tests. We're looking at their similarity to each other to find out which ones are different species, and we're using the morphological species concept, and I have some examples of both of these for you. Okay, so I'll come back to populations in a second, but species are composed of one to many populations. We'll talk about that soon. Okay, here are some examples of biological species. Remember, that means potential interbreeding. We've got some large herbivores here, a camel, a llama, and a horse. Okay, so they're big and they look different, and in fact, they are not capable of breeding with each other. I'm sure we've done that test many times by letting them live together. No, they don't make crosses. But there are some cases where two things that look like different species, they may blur the line between whether they're true separate biological species or not. It's hard to tell. So in this case, maybe you know that horses and donkeys or burros have the capacity to interbreed. I don't think they do it in nature. I'm not sure about that, but it can be done in farms, on the pasture where the horses and the donkeys, they breed, and their offspring is called a mule. It shares the characteristic traits of both biological species, of both of the, I guess, morphological species. So mule, it's kind of half horse, half donkey, and it makes you wonder, well, are horses and donkeys true biological species if they can interbreed? And as you probably know, mules are sterile. Mules are unable to breed. And so this is just one of those, there's rarely in nature and in biology are there bright shining lines between defined things. And this is a case where those lines get a little bit blurred. But at least by talking about them, hopefully it cements in your mind the concept of a biological species having to do with the potential for breeding. Excuse me. Okay, here's some examples of morphological species. So let's say you're a butterfly collector and you arrive on a new continent where no butterfly collector has been before, and you collect these 4 different kinds of butterflies. And if you look at them very carefully and you look at the distribution of white spots, I guess, I don't really know what butterfly people look at, you'll say, oh, these guys are different from these, and these guys are different from these, and these guys are different from these, and you type it up in a paper and you publish it, and you are naming these as new species. You are not doing biological testing. That is acceptable because you're defining morphospecies, okay? So they probably don't breed with each other, but until you do the test, you can't always be sure. Okay, so make sure you understand that the species, what a species is, and has 2 different definitions. Now, I referred to populations earlier because it's really hard to talk about species without talking about populations. So let's dig in. A population is, here's the definition, the interbreeding group in a specific area. Okay, so let's distinguish that from the common term of the use population as meaning population size, the number of individuals. Okay, so here's people will often say the population of, for instance, Humboldt County is that. But really what they're talking about is the population size. Okay, the population size of humans in Humboldt County is 135,000. That would be a good way of being very specific with your language. When we talk about population as a noun, though, usually we're talking about the interbreeding group in a specific area. So a population biologically has to do with the potential for interbreeding and also some geographical component. Okay, an interbreeding group in a specific area. So let me run you through several imaginary scenarios. Let's take imaginary species A, and by the way, this is I call it an eastern cardinal. I'm not sure if that's the right name, but I called him a cardinal. I grew up in New York and I used to see these birds, and they're wonderful. That's a male. They're beautiful, and they're called a cardinal. And I went to Hawaii recently, and I was just shocked to find cardinals on Hawaii. And Hawaii is just a mess of immigrants, of introduced species, including birds and lizards and plants and rats and snakes and all kinds of things. It's just this hodgepodge of different species, and it makes you feel sorry for the native populations. But anyway, I'm going to do I don't know what the population distribution of cardinals is on Hawaii. So the following parts of this lecture are imaginary. So let's imagine this bird can actually fly from island to island and has set up breeding colonies on each of them. And let's just say that it is not possible for this species to fly away from the island and breed with the continents, the nearest continents. Okay, so that means they're isolated by breeding, and yet the organisms on the different islands are not isolated from each other. They hop back and forth, they fly back and forth, and so there's breeding is sort of continuous over time throughout this entire population, okay, across all the islands. Okay, so that's imaginary species, an imaginary population situation. Now, it won't take much stretch of the imagination to imagine a case where, well, maybe this bird can't fly across this gap between these oceans. And so it set up a population here and one here maybe somehow, but they are no longer interbreeding with each other. And so then we can have a situation kind of like this, where we have one species, in this case, the cardinal, and it is broken up into 4 distinct populations. This one here, and the birds can fly across this gap, but not this gap, and this group of islands, and this group, and that group. Okay, so now we have 4 distinct populations. Okay, I hope that's clear. Now, again, there's always fuzzy lines in biology, and usually where there are adjacent populations, it really means that breeding is restricted between these zones. And you might be able to quantify how isolated the populations are genetically, but maybe they haven't diverged into new species yet, which is how evolution is supposed to work, one way it works. But sometimes there will be a breeding individual from one population going into another population, and that's just part of the whole game. Here's a more extreme view where every single island is a population. And you can imagine maybe something like a lizard that can't swim. How did it get to all these different islands? Maybe humans brought them there, or who knows what. But that would just be an extreme case of lots of populations here on the island. Okay, now it doesn't have to be water isolating populations. It could be other things as well. And I have a little note down here. Look at Google Earth Bufo Excel, and I wanted to show you this place I used to live in a study I did once. So here's North America, and I used to live, here's California, the Central Valley of California, and here are the Sierra Nevada, and I used to live in the eastern side of the Sierras, still in California, barely. This is Nevada over here, in a place called Deep Springs Valley. And if you look at this valley, it's surrounded by what are called the White Mountains of California, and it has a little ranch and a college in this end of the valley, which is why I was there. But I was also studying these toads that live down here. This white area is a salt pan called a playa. It's a temporary lake that concentrates salts over long periods of time. And let me just turn things around a little bit to show you better. Let's see, is it this? Yeah, I'm going to go the other way. All right, we're going to turn around. So this playa is at the low end of the valley, and it is surrounded by these very steep mountains here. Now I'm going to tilt the screen a little bit. Can I do this? Tilt it up? Yeah. And we'll zoom in here in a sec. Okay, that's that's Eureka Valley in the distance, and then Death Valley. Here's Deep Springs Valley, and here's the playa. And at the base of these mountains is a very active geologic fault. And at that crack in the earth, water bubbles up. And so there are springs at the base of the mountains. You can see here's a little lake. There's some springs above it, and there's some springs around here, and there's some springs over here. And just a little background information, you should understand that at the last ice age, temperatures globally were much cooler, and this area was not the desert that it is now. It was once much more wet, and somehow this toad species got into this area, and we call it the black toad now. And it has This is the last place in the world that it lives, because since the ice age and the temperature warming and the drying up of the valley, these toads are now isolated here. They can't hop around to other valleys, to the Central Valley, or go anywhere. They're stuck here. But we were interested in whether the toads that lived in this spring area were genetically distinct from the toads that lived in this area. In other words, what is the population structure of this biological species? And so we went in here and we had different ways of sampling these guys. And what we found was, just to get it really, to finish off, is that the toads here actually are not a distinct population, but there are toads over here, and these guys are genetically quite different from these guys. And in fact, there's another spring, I can't remember exactly where it is, on this side of the valley. Maybe it's over here. There's another spring over here that has some toads in it, and it is genetically distinct as well. So we were able to see in this one very perfect example of how a species can be isolated into different populations, and having really nothing to do with open bodies of water. So there's maybe mountain ranges can form barriers. For instance, in the Great Basin, let me northify this again. In the Great Basin of California, you have mountain and valley and mountain and valley and mountain and valley. And so the species that live up here in the mountains that need this habitat might be unable to cross these valleys. And that might not be true of birds, but it may be true of small mammals. And so this has been an area of a lot of interesting population level research. Okay, so make sure you understand, whoops, where are we? Here. Make sure you understand all about what populations are. Okay, any questions? No? Okay, I will continue. Okay, so the next step in that level of hierarchy is the community level. So we've talked about species, we've talked about individuals, populations, species, and now we'll talk about communities. So a biotic community, let's define it. It's an assemblage of populations of different species in a natural area. It's not a zoo. I suppose you could talk about the community, the zoo community. That's not a natural thing. I'm interested in the natural stuff here. So in nature, in particular areas, you look around and you see different species, and those species are composed of populations, and the populations interact with each other. So look in the background here, these are baobab trees. So there's a population of baobab trees. There's some other plants in here too. No doubt there's reptiles and amphibians maybe, and plants and all sorts of other organisms living here. And those different species are occupying this place in populations, and those populations in this natural area are interacting. Okay, so the correct term is biotic community. I'll just call it a community from now on. So a community, if one wonders, well, what determines a community? What determines what species are present in a particular area? And it's a big question for ecologists. And it turns out a community is determined primarily by the abiotic factors, not so much the biology stuff, but the abiotic factors such as the presence or absence of water, the climate, the salinity of the soil or the water, whatever you're talking about, and what kind of soil types. And in tiny little print, it's more complicated than this. So let's just say you take an island and you put it anywhere on Earth, and then you sort of sprinkle species all over it. Many will die because they're not adapted to that habitat type, but others will live. And so the ones that live are determined by the abiotic factors on that island where you put it. Okay, it also determines what species end up confronted with that habitat too. Okay, so but a community tends to be named for its plants. So like a redwood forest, we're talking about, oh, it's a redwood forest community, or it's a prairie grassland, and that name implies an assemblage of different species. Okay, so this is important. And when I give a sentence like this to you in a lecture, I suggest you really study it well and you try to understand what it means, and also to block out or delete certain words and then test yourself. So what's this sentence say? It's that This sentence says, populations of different species within a biotic community constantly interact. Okay, so we're talking about a community, and a community has populations of different species in it, and they are continuously interacting. Now remember, we're trying to understand the rules of the game. So in the rules of the game on Earth, one is that there is interaction among populations of different species within a biotic community. Constant interaction. They interact with each other, and so there's interspecies interactions. For instance, there's birds that live in the trees. That's an interaction. And they also interact with a biotic environment. So for instance, the trees or all the plants are receiving sunlight and carbon dioxide and engaging in the equation of life on Earth. So that is also an interaction. Okay, so just in small print down here, I ask you what sorts of interactions, and I want you to think about these things. What cycles and what flows through ecosystems, and how do populations enable that? What about like the chemical macronutrients? How are they flowing through, or are they cycling? And how, if they're cycling, which they are, how so? And photosynthesis and respiration, those parts of the equation of life on Earth. Okay, so let's put it all together. Populations of different species. Now you should know what species are, like morphospecies, biological species, is not clear, doesn't matter, but populations of them within a biotic community, so in a particular area, these different individuals, members of populations of different species, are constantly interacting with each other and with the abiotic environment. Big sentence, make sure you understand every part of it. Okay, now the study of this interaction is called ecology. Okay, so in a backwards way, we have just defined what ecology is. Make sure you know what that is. So let's now take the next level up and talk about ecosystems. And this is kind of troubling to many people, including me, because the concept of ecosystems is a little bit fuzzy. Here is a good the best definition that I like. It's an interactive complex of communities and the abiotic environment affecting them within an area. Okay, so it's a bunch of different communities, and it includes the abiotic environment in an area. Okay, so let's just take a forest, for instance, a redwood forest. Well, a redwood forest at the big level may not be just forest. It may also include riparian areas that are dominated by alder tree. There might be some balds, some areas where there's fires or different soil types that have made it not a redwood forest. And so it is an interactive complex of communities. So one of the problems with the term of an ecosystem is that they have fuzzy boundaries. If someone says to you, hey, our local redwood ecosystem is blah, 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 you need to ask them, well, when you say that forest redwood ecosystem, what is the boundaries you're putting around that? Okay, so you need to ask people to identify or to explain what they mean by an ecosystem when you have that conversation, if it's important to you. Okay, they lack distinct boundaries and are not isolated. Also, importantly, species can occupy multiple ecosystems and migrate between them. So, for instance, Canada geese. Canada geese migrate from the Arctic Circle way down south. I don't know how far they go, but along the way, they cross many different communities and ecosystems. Okay, so ecosystems are linked also by the migrants that pass through them. Okay, so here is just this. I keep coming back and back to this because it is so important. This is the rule of the game. There's a continuous flow of energy and an exchange of nutrients among all the members of a community. Okay, so they're exchanging nutrients, they're eating each other, giving each other nutrients and energy within a community, and between communities and ecosystems, and between communities and the abiotic environment. Okay, here's a big slide, bunch of words, make sure you understand what it means. Okay, and this whole concept is tried is communicated in a number of different ways. And here are 4 different diagrams that show that. I'm not going to dwell on them. You can study them on your own and convince yourself that they demonstrate the flow of energy through and the exchange of nutrients, or the cycling of nutrients within ecosystems. And I'm just going to focus on this one because we've seen it before when we talked about the equation of life on Earth. And here it is again, just to emphasize the flow of energy through and the cycling of nutrients. But now you know that this flow of energy and this cycling of nutrients is done by populations of species within communities and among communities within an ecosystem and even between ecosystems. Okay, I will leave you with that. In our face-to-face lecture, we'll be talking more about the structure of biological communities. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a great time until I see you next time. Bye.